The Galactic Union's council chamber floated like a giant glass bubble among the stars, orbiting a glowing red planet no one bothered to name. Inside, hundreds of alien species sat in rows that stretched up to the ceiling, their strange voices buzzing through the air. The Vornith, tall creatures with shimmering scales and wings that crackled with faint energy, took the center stage. They were the Union's unofficial leaders, always acting like they owned the galaxy. Today, they were angry, and everyone could feel it. Their commander, Kale, stood with his chest puffed out, his deep voice rumbling as he pointed a claw at the human sitting near the back. The human's name was Jack. He wasn't what anyone expected from Earth's people. No fancy suit, no shiny gadgets, just a man in a worn jacket, his hands rough from years of work. His dark hair was messy, and his eyes carried a spark that made the aliens uneasy. Jack had been a farmer on Nova 9, a dusty little planet humans had claimed a few decades ago. When the Union demanded a representative, the colony picked him, not because he was loud or important, but because he listened, thought fast, and never gave up. Now, he leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, watching Kale rant like it was just another day. These humans, Kale said, his wings twitching, are a problem. They spread too fast, build too much, and break every rule we set. Look at Nova 9. A dead rock, they said. Now it's full of their machines and noise. This is reckless. Dangerous. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. The Vornith weren't wrong, humans were new to the Union, barely a speck in the galaxy's history, yet they'd turned Nova 9 into something alive in just 20 years. Plants grew where nothing should, water flowed from dry stone, and lights blinked across the surface like tiny stars. It scared the older species, who liked things slow and predictable. Jack didn't flinch. He'd heard this before. The Vornith loved their rules, their perfect order. They flew faster than light, built cities in the sky, and thought they knew everything. But Jack knew something they didn't. Humans didn't win by being perfect. They won by refusing to lose. He scratched his chin, waiting for Kale to finish. The alien scales glowed brighter with every word, a sign he was working himself up. We demand limits. Kale roared. No more expansion, no more chaos. Or we'll make them stop. The chamber went quiet. A challenge hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Other species, blobby trells, spiky gorvans, and wispy lume, turned their eyes, or whatever they used to see, toward Jack. He stood slowly, brushing dust off his jacket. Limits, huh? He said, his voice steady and clear. You want us to sit still while you keep growing? Doesn't sound fair. Kale's wings snapped open, a flash of energy rippling through them. Fair. You're ants pretending to be giants. Prove you belong here, or leave. Jack grinned, and it wasn't a friendly grin. It was the kind that made you wonder what he was planning. Prove it. All right. How about a test? Your best against ours. One fight, no tricks, just skill. If we win, you back off. If you win, we'll talk about your limits. The crowd gasped. A test, a duel, was an old Union tradition, rarely used anymore. It was how species settled big arguments when words failed. The Vornith hadn't expected this. Kale's scales dimmed for a moment, then flared again. You dare, he hissed. Fine. We choose Zor, our strongest. Tomorrow, in the arena. You'll regret this, human. Jack nodded, like he'd just agreed to a friendly bet. Tomorrow it is. See you there. He sat back down, ignoring the stares. The chamber exploded into chatter as Kale stormed off with his advisors. The trells bubbled with excitement, the gorvans clicked their claws, and the lume whispered in faint, glowing pulses. No one knew what Jack was thinking. Humans were small, soft, unimpressive. Zor was a Vornith champion, a monster of muscle and metal, built for war. What could Jack possibly have up his sleeve? Back on Nova 9, the news spread fast. Jack's comm buzzed with messages from the colony. "You sure about this?" asked Mira, his old friend who ran the water pumps. "They're saying Zor's unbeatable." Jack chuckled, staring out at the fields he'd helped plant. "Unbeatable's just a word, Mira. We've faced worse than some winged bully." She sighed. "You're crazy, Jack. But we trust you. Show 'em what we're made of." He switched off the comm and looked at the stars. The Vornith thought they were calling his bluff. They didn't know humans didn't bluff, they built. The next morning, the Union's arena loomed ahead, a massive ring of crystal and steel floating in space. Jack stepped off the shuttle, carrying nothing but a small tool belt slung over his shoulder. Alien guards eyed him, their faces, or lack of them, showing confusion. "Where's your gear?" one asked, a Gorvan with spikes rattling. Jack patted the belt. "Right here. Don't need much else." The guard clicked in disbelief but let him pass. Inside, the Vornith were already preparing Zor. The champion towered over everyone, his scales fused with metal plates, his wings buzzing with power. His claws gleamed, sharp enough to cut stone. Kale watched from a high platform, smirking as Zor flexed for the crowd. Jack didn't look impressed. He stretched his arms, cracked his neck, and waited. The aliens whispered. Was he scared? Stupid? Or something else? Kale's voice boomed through the arena. "This human thinks he can stand against us. Let him learn his place." The crowd cheered, but Jack just smiled. He wasn't here to lose. He was here to show them what happened when you underestimated a human's heart, and a human's mind. The duel was about to begin, and the galaxy was about to get a surprise. The Union's arena shimmered under the light of 3 distant suns, its crystal walls reflecting every cheer and gasp from the crowd. Floating platforms packed with aliens hovered above the wide, circular floor where the duel would unfold. The air buzzed with excitement, thick with the sense of alien breath and the faint crackle of energy. Zor, the Vornith champion, stepped into the center, his massive form casting a shadow that stretched far. His metal-plated scales gleamed, and his wings hummed with a low, menacing pulse. Claws scraped the ground, leaving faint scratches on the unbreakable surface. The crowd roared, their voices a wild mix of clicks, hisses, and glows. They'd seen Zor fight before. They knew what he could do. Jack walked out from the other side, his boots tapping lightly against the floor. He looked tiny next to Zor, barely half the champion's height, with no armor, no weapons, just that worn jacket and a tool belt dangling at his hip. The aliens laughed, a ripple of sound spreading through the platforms. Trells bubbled in amusement, Gorvans rattled their spikes, and even the quiet Lumate pulsed with faint, mocking light. "This is their champion," a Trell gurgled. "He'll be paced in 10 seconds. Jack didn't react. He scanned the arena, noting the floating drones projecting the fight across the galaxy, then glanced at Zor. His lips twitched into a half-smile. Kale's voice cut through the noise, booming from his platform high above. "Behold the Vornith's might. Zor will crush this human and end their reckless dreams. Begin." A chime rang out, sharp and clear, and Zor moved. He didn't hesitate. His wings flared, sending a blast of hot air across the arena as he launched forward. Claws slashed down, aiming to split Jack in half. The crowd leaned closer, expecting blood. But Jack wasn't there. At the last second, he stepped aside, not a big leap, just a small, calm shift. Zor's claws hit the floor, sparking against the surface, and the crowd went still for a heartbeat. Zor spun, wings buzzing louder, and charged again. This time, he swung wide, his metal arm sweeping like a blade. Jack ducked, rolling under the strike with a grunt. As he came up, he pulled something from his belt, a tiny metal disc, no bigger than a coin. He flicked it onto the ground behind him and kept moving. Zor stomped forward, roaring, and stepped right on the disc. A sharp crack echoed as a burst of light flared under his foot, making him stumble. It wasn't much, just a flash and a pop, but it threw him off. The crowd blinked, confused. "What was that?" a Gorvan muttered. Jack didn't stop. He darted around Zor, staying low, his eyes locked on the champion's every move. Zor recovered fast, his scales glowing brighter as he unleashed a new trick. His wings snapped forward, releasing a wave of energy that tore across the arena. The air sizzled, and the floor blackened where it hit. Jack dove behind a low barrier, one of the arena's few features, barely dodging the blast. The crowd cheered again, thinking Zor had him now. But Jack popped up, brushing soot off his jacket, and tossed another gadget from his belt. This one was a thin wire with weights on each end. It spun through the air and wrapped around Zor's leg, tangling for a moment before the giant yanked it free. "He's playing with him," Alume whispered, its glow flickering. Kale leaned forward, his smirk fading. Zor wasn't winning as fast as he'd promised. The Vornith champion roared again, louder this time, and charged with both claws out. Jack sidestepped, pulling a small tube from his belt. He squeezed it, and a puff of gray dust shot into Zor's face. The giant coughed, shaking his head, and swung blindly. Jack ducked under the arm, grabbed the loose scale Zor had shed in the stumble, and tucked it into his pocket. The crowd didn't know what to make of it. Was he fighting or collecting souvenirs? Zor's wings flared again, and he took to the air, hovering a few feet off the ground. His claws retracted, replaced by glowing tips that fired sharp bursts of light. The shots rained down, carving smoking holes in the floor. Jack ran, weaving between the blasts with a speed that didn't match his laid-back look. He slid behind another barrier, pulled out a handful of screws and a small motor from his belt, and started tinkering. The drone zoomed in, showing his hands moving fast, twisting, connecting, building something. Zor landed with a thud, stomping toward him, and the crowd held its breath. What was the human doing? Jack popped up, holding a crude device, a fan made of scavenged parts, spinning fast. He aimed it at Zor and flipped a switch. The gray dust from earlier, still floating in the air, swirled into a thick cloud, blinding the champion again. Zor roared, slashing wildly, but Jack was already gone, circling behind him. "Nice wings," Jack called out, loud enough for the drones to catch. "Bet they're heavy, though." Zor spun, furious, and charged straight at the voice. Jack dropped another disc, this one sparked and stuck to Zor's leg, buzzing with a faint electric hum. The giant flinched, his movement slowing for a split second. The aliens weren't laughing anymore. The trells stopped bubbling, the Gorvans went quiet, and the Lume pulsed with nervous light. Kale gripped the edge of his platform, his scales dimming. Zor was a marvel of Vornith engineering, stronger, faster, deadlier than anything humans could dream of. Yet this soft, tiny creature was dancing around him, turning the fight into a game. Jack wasn't just lucky. He was smart. Every dodge, every trick, showed he'd planned this, not with weapons or armor, but with his mind and whatever junk he carried. Zor regained his footing, shaking off the electric buzz. His wings glowed brighter, and he launched into the air again, higher this time. The crowd cheered as he aimed his claws downward, ready to dive. Jack watched, his grin fading into a focused stare. He reached into his belt one more time, pulling out a small black box with a blinking light. He pressed a button, and the discs he'd scattered earlier beeped in unison. Tiny jets of gas puffed out, filling the air with a faint shimmer. Zor dove, claws gleaming, and the gas ignited, boom, a flash of fire that singed his wings and sent him crashing to the ground. The arena shook. Dust settled around Zor as he struggled to stand, his scales smoking. Jack walked forward, calm as ever, wiping sweat from his brow. "Not bad," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But I've seen worse storms on Nova 9. The crowd stared, stunned. Kale's wings twitched, his confidence cracking. This wasn't a duel anymore, it was a lesson, and the teacher was a human with a tool belt and a spark in his eye. Zor growled, pushing himself up. The fight wasn't over, but the doubt had begun. The galaxy was watching, and humanity wasn't what they'd thought. The arena's crystal walls trembled as Zor pulled himself up from the smoking crater he'd made in the floor. His metal scales were scorched, one wing bent at an odd angle, but his eyes glowed with fury. The Vornith champion wasn't done, not by a long shot. The crowd, silent for a moment after Jack's fiery trick, erupted again, their cheers a wild mix of shock and thrill. Trells splashed in their gooey seats, Gorvins clacked their claws, and Lume pulsed with frantic light. They'd come for a quick slaughter, but this human was turning it into a show. High above, Kale's wings twitched, his scales flickering between pride and worry. Zor was his pride, his proof of Vornith power. Jack was making him look like a fool. Jack stood a few steps away, breathing harder now but still steady. His jacket was singed, his tool belt lighter after using half its contents. He wiped sweat from his face and watched Zor rise. The giant shook off the damage, his wings buzzing unevenly as he adjusted. Then, with a roar that shook the air, Zor charged again. This time, he was smarter. His claws stayed low, swiping at Jack's legs, while his wings fired short bursts of energy to cut off escapes. Jack dodged the first swing, but a blast grazed his arm, tearing the sleeve and leaving a red mark. He winced, rolling away, and the crowd leaned forward, hungry for the turn they'd expected. Zor pressed the attack, his massive form closing the gap. Jack scrambled back, pulling a bent metal rod from his belt, something he'd grabbed earlier from Zor's shed scales. He jammed it into the floor and ducked as Zor's claw smashed down, hitting the rod instead. It bent but held, giving Jack a second to slip away. The champion snarled, ripping the rod free and tossing it aside. His wings flared wider, and he leapt into the air, hovering just out of reach. Energy gathered at his claw tips, brighter than before, and he fired a barrage of glowing bolts. The floor erupted in sparks and smoke, forcing Jack to run. He darted between blasts, his boots slipping on the charred surface. Zor was adapting, learning Jack's tricks and tightening the net. A bolt struck close, knocking Jack off his feet. He hit the ground hard, rolling to a stop near the arena's edge. The crowd roared, sensing the end. Zor landed with a thud, stalking forward, his scales glowing like a furnace. Jack pushed himself up, clutching his side, and for the first time, he looked cornered. Kale stood taller on his platform, his smirk returning. "Finish him," he shouted, wings snapping open. But Jack wasn't done. He reached into his belt, hands shaking slightly, and pulled out a small black box, not the one from before, but a new one, scratched and dented. He flipped it open, revealing a mess of wires and a tiny spinning core. Zor paused, tilting his head, then lunged with claws outstretched. Jack pressed a switch, and a high-pitched whine filled the air. Zor's wings faltered mid-strike, their energy flickering as the device pulsed. The crowd gasped as the champion stumbled, his glowing scales dimming. Jack had built it from scraps during the fight, a disruptor, tuned to mess with Zor's bioengineered power. Zor roared, shaking off the effect, but Jack was already moving. He grabbed a shard of broken floor and threw it, aiming for the bent wing. It hit, and Zor flinched, giving Jack an opening. He charged, not away, but straight at the giant. The crowd went wild, unsure what they were seeing. Jack leapt, grabbing Zor's arm and swinging onto his back. Using a screwdriver from his belt, he pried at a loose scale, exposing a bundle of glowing wires beneath. Zor thrashed, trying to shake him off, but Jack held tight, jamming the screwdriver in deeper. Sparks flew, and one wing went dark, dropping Zor to a knee. Jack slid off, landing hard but rolling to his feet. His chest heaved, his arm bled, but his eyes burned with something fierce. Zor swung a claw, slower now, and Jack dodged, his mind racing. He wasn't just fighting a monster, he was fighting for Nova 9, for every human who'd clawed a life from nothing. He saw it in his head, the first days on that barren rock, the dust storms that buried their shelters, the nights they went hungry. They'd built pumps from junk, grew food in cracked soil, and lit the dark with scavenged power. Humans didn't quit. They burned brighter when the odds got worse. Zor stood again, his remaining wing buzzing weakly. He roared and charged, claws slashing in a desperate arc. Jack ducked, grabbing a piece of wire from the ground, the one he'd thrown earlier. He looped it around Zor's leg as the giant passed, yanking hard. Zor tripped, crashing face first into the floor. Jack didn't wait. He climbed onto Zor's back again, this time aiming for the neck. With a grunt, he drove the screwdriver into a gap between scales, twisting until something snapped. Zor's body jerked, his glow fading, and he slumped, breathing hard but still alive. The crowd was silent, stunned. Jack stepped back, wiping blood from his lip. "Stay down," he said, voice low but firm. Zor growled, pushing up on one arm, his pride refusing to break. Jack sighed, then pulled the disruptor from his belt again. He cranked it higher, and the whine grew shrill. Zor's scales flickered, then went dark. He collapsed fully this time, motionless but breathing. Jack tossed the device aside, its core smoking, and turned to face the crowd. His jacket hung in tatters, his arm dripped red, but he stood tall. Kale leapt from his platform, landing near Zor with a furious hiss. "Stop this," he shouted, wings flaring. "This proves nothing." Jack met his glare, unflinching. "It proves we don't bow," he said. "You pushed us, Kale. We pushed back." The drones caught every word, beaming it across the galaxy. The Trells stopped splashing, the Gorvans froze, and the Lume glowed steady, captivated. Zor groaned, trying to rise, but Jack knelt beside him. "Rest," he said, almost gentle. "You fought well." The arena buzzed with whispers. Humans weren't supposed to win, not like this, not with scraps and grit against a Vornith war machine. But Jack had turned the fight inside out, using every trick, every ounce of will. Kale's scales dimmed, his authority shaken. The crowd didn't cheer, they watched, waiting, feeling the shift. Jack straightened, looking up at the platforms. He didn't say it, but they all felt it. Humanity's fire wasn't loud or perfect, but it burned hot and deep. And it wasn't going out anytime soon. The arena hung in a silence so thick it felt alive, broken only by the faint hum of Zor's scales as he lay defeated on the cracked floor. Smoke curled from his bent wing, and his chest rose and fell in slow, heavy breaths. Jack stood over him, his own breath ragged, blood streaking his arm and staining his torn jacket. The tool belt at his hip was nearly empty now, its last scraps spent in a fight no one thought he could win. The floating platforms above buzzed with alien eyes, hundreds of species staring down, their chatter replaced by a stunned hush. Trells sat still in their goo, Gorvans held their claws mid-click, and Lume pulsed with faint, unsure light. The galaxy had watched, and the galaxy had changed. Kale landed hard beside Zor, his wings snapping shut with a crack. His scales flared red, then dulled to a shaky gray. "This is madness," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the crystal walls. "A trick. A fluke. Humans can't." He stopped, glaring at Jack, who wiped blood from his lip and met the Vornitha's gaze without blinking. "Can't what?" Jack asked, calm but sharp. "Can't fight? Can't win? Looks like we just did." Kale's claws twitched, but he didn't move. The drones hovered closer, catching every word, every flicker of doubt in the Vornitha's eyes. The crowd stirred at last, a ripple of sound spreading through the platforms. A Gorvan shouted, "He cheated," but a Trell bubbled back, "No rules against it." The Lume pulsed brighter, their whispers forming a soft hum. Jack didn't flinch. He turned from Kale and faced Zor, who groaned and lifted his head. The champion's scales flickered weakly, pride warring with exhaustion. Jack knelt beside him, voice low. "You're tough, Zor. Tougher than anything I've seen. But this wasn't about breaking you." Zor's eyes narrowed, then softened, and he slumped back, accepting the loss. Kale spun toward the high platform where the Union's elders sat, old aliens with long tendrils and glowing shells. "End this farce," he demanded. "The Vornith won't stand for it." But the elders didn't move. One, a wispy figure with a voice like wind, spoke through the arena's system. "The duel is valid. Victory goes to the human." The words hit like a shockwave. Kale froze, and the crowd exploded, cheers, hisses, and gasps crashing together. Jack stood, brushing dust off his hands, and looked up at the elders. "So, we done here?" Before Kale could answer, a new sound cut through the chaos, a slow, rhythmic thudding. Figures emerged from the arena's tunnels, Vornith advisors, their wings folded tight, scales dim with unease. Behind them came others, Gorvans, Trells, even a few Lume drifting like glowing clouds. They weren't cheering or fighting. They were watching Jack, curious, maybe afraid. One Gorvan, its spikes rattling, stepped forward. "How?" it asked, voice rough. "How'd you do it with that?" It pointed at the scattered scraps, wires, discs, a broken fan, littering the floor. Jack grinned, tired but real. "We don't have your claws or wings. We've got this." He tapped his head, then his chest. "And this. Nova 9 was nothing but dirt when we got there. No water, no air, no hope. We made it work. Built it with whatever we had. That's what humans do." The Gorvan tilted its head, spikes still, and others leaned closer. Kale hissed, "You think this changes anything? You're still weak." But his words sounded hollow now, and the crowd wasn't listening to him, they were listening to Jack. He stepped onto a broken chunk of floor, raising his voice so the drones could carry it far. "We didn't come here to take your galaxy. We came to live in it. You pushed us, Kale, and we showed you what happens when we push back. But it doesn't have to be like this. We can build together, share what we know." He paused, letting the idea sink in. Humans don't just fight. We learn. We grow. And we don't stop. The arena went quiet again, but it wasn't shock this time, it was thought. The Trells bubbled softly, the Gorvans clicked, and the Lume glowed steady. Kale's wings drooped. He looked at Zor, then at Jack, and finally at the crowd. "You'd share with us?" he asked, suspicion lacing his tone. Jack nodded. "Why not? We've already got better pumps than you, might as well trade." A ripple of laughter broke the tension, even from a few Vornith advisors. Kale didn't laugh, but his scales settled into a neutral blue. "We'll discuss it," he muttered, turning away. It wasn't surrender, but it was close enough. The elders signaled the end, and the platforms began to empty. But not everyone left. A group of Trells sloshed over, asking about Jack's water pumps. A Gorvan lingered, eyeing the disruptor's remains. Even a Lume drifted near, its light pulsing with questions. Jack answered them all, his voice steady despite the ache in his bones. Word spread fast. By nightfall, Nova 9's comms lit up with messages. Myra's voice crackled through first. "You alive, Jack?" He chuckled, leaning against a crate in the shuttle bay. "Barely. Told you we'd show, Em." She laughed. "Yeah, you did. Now they're all calling us. What did you start?" He didn't answer right away. He stepped outside, the stars stretching endless above the arena's dome. The Vornith had tested him, and he'd turned their game upside down. But this wasn't the end, it was the start. Other species would come now, some to challenge, some to learn. Humans would meet them all, with tools in their hands and fire in their hearts. Jack thought of Nova 9, the fields he'd planted, the homes they'd built. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And they'd keep building, no matter who watched. The shuttle hummed, ready to take him home. As it lifted off, the arena shrank below, a glittering speck in the dark. The galaxy had seen humanity's rage, not loud or wild, but clever and unbreakable. They'd seen it win. And now, they'd see what came next. Jack closed his eyes, a small smile on his lips. The stars were big, but humans were stubborn. They'd find a way to light them up, one spark at a time.